right. Well, welcome to Fantastic Falcons. Very first episode. Our guest today is the lovely Dr. Montana Miller. She is a associate professor at BGSU of pop culture, as well as a world championship skydiver and a folklorist, and among many other things, I'm sure. Let's see, you got your bachelor's at Harvard, correct? Master's and PhD at UCLA.
That's right.
Sweet. All right. Am I missing anything about just like general background that you want to share?
Oh, sure.
Well, I know like there's some stuff I'm going to. I mean, like.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's important to point out that I didn't actually go to college right after high school. When I was a high school student, I suddenly realized that what I wanted to do for my career was be a flying trapeze artist. And so this was back in 1987. So we didn't have internet, you know. And I was not from a circus family. I grew up in a newspaper family. My parents ran the small newspaper in a small town in Harvard, Massachusetts. Harvard, Massachusetts, not connected to the university, just same name. So we had some friends living in France who helped me like find out how to audition for the French National Circus Training center, where it's kind of like a university, an elite school, where in France circus arts are like a major, very highly respected art. But I found out that France was the place to go through just going to a really good circus in the United States and talking to the trapeze artists. And they said, if you want to become like a professional, you have to get serious training. And so you have to, go to the school. So I went over there as a senior in high school, auditioned for the school. I was the first American to get in, and that's what I did after high school. I moved to France by myself, spoke a little bit of French, quickly got fluent, and spent the next 4 or 5 years just totally immersed in the French circus world. I was in a flying trapeze troupe with 4 young French men who became like my brothers in the good and the bad ways. They made my life miserable, but I also really loved them. And for like 8 to 10 hours a day, we trained and performed and toured. And so that was my life for quite a while. And it was a really difficult life. I mean, having been through that, really put everything else afterward in perspective. Even the really tough jobs I had after that, like I've told my students about waitressing and, huge restaurants, and that's a really hard job too, but nothing really compares to being a circus performer doing really dangerous, difficult, painful stuff, and you really can't take a day off. Like, the show must go on is not just a cliche. So, the point at which I applied to college, I had gotten injured, and the circus that I was working with had gone temporarily bankrupt. And I wasn't sure that my injury was actually going to heal because my hand was crushed, and that's really bad for a trapeze artist. So not knowing what was going to happen with my circus career and realizing that my SAT scores were only valid for a limited time, like 4 years, I thought I'd better apply to college now and like get my foot in the door, and then I can always like finish it up later. So I ended up applying to Harvard, knowing that Harvard was friendly towards students that were a bit out of the box. They seek out people that are unique and special in some way. Honestly, I think Harvard just wants students that will make Harvard more famous. And I was pretty well known as, like ABC News had done a feature on me, like first American to be in the French circus school. So I was kind of famous for a, 22-year-old. And I think that's why Harvard accepted me. When I got to Harvard, I immediately took up diving because I needed some kind of acrobatic outlet. And then I spent my 4 years at Harvard totally immersed in competitive diving, hoping to make the Olympics in platform diving. So I was exhausted because, again, I was training all the time. As a varsity athlete, you're doing double workouts, you're getting up at 5 in the morning, you're always tired. So it was hard for me to stay awake through my classes. So I was looking for a department that had, number one, small classes, because in a big lecture hall, I had no hope of staying awake. I was going to just, fall asleep the minute the professor started lecturing. So I needed small classes where I'd be at a table with a professor, not a grad student, like a really good professor, small group of students. And I actually did not care whether my major was going to lead to a job because I thought I'd be going back to circus performing.
Mm-hmm.
So I had found the folklore department, and it was perfect. You know, tiny classes, 5 people majored in it every year. I knew all my professors. They were great. The classes were interesting, and that is why I majored in folklore. And by the time I was graduating, my mentor, my favorite professor, told me about this great graduate program at UCLA that where she knew the guy that ran it, and she knew I would be a good fit for it. And at that point, I was still sort of in the diving world, and I had started professional diving and was like diving from 80-foot perches into tiny pools in theme parks. And then I was invited to compete in Acapulco in the cliff diving championships. This was 1996. So the same year I graduated from college, I went and competed in Acapulco. And again, that was like a big media thing. And again, I think I got into grad school based on like how interesting that was, and that I was able to talk about high-risk subcultures and performance ethnography. And, you know, I kind of knew how to spin all these experiences into an academic way of talking. And I think that got me into grad school. So that's how I ended up getting a master's and PhD in folklore at UCLA, thanks to my mentor at Harvard directing me toward that program. But none of these degrees did I ever think was going to lead to a job, because folklore is not a field that has many jobs, and the ones that are available go to, you know, academic superstars, not people that are mainly in school so they have health insurance for their extreme sports and their circus careers. So me ending up as a professor was kind of an unexpected, unplanned career twist.
Well, how is it? How do you like being a professor?
I love it. But I don't love all of it. What I love is the aspect of performing. I mean, my identity was formed as a performer during those, you know, very important years from 17 to 22 that most people are in college. I was becoming a circus artist. And for me, the opportunity to speak to a group of people, which, you know, it doesn't really make me nervous to speak to groups of people, because compared to diving from an 80-foot perch into a pool for groups of people, or doing a triple back off the flying trapeze and trying to catch it in front of 3,000 people, like the pressure is much less when you're just giving a talk. Yeah. So for me, that opportunity to speak to students, to maybe influence their lives, maybe, you know, open their minds and raise their awareness of things that they might not have known about, I find that really fun, really inspiring. I really love it. But there's a lot of parts of being a professor that are really hard for me. So for example, I have a lot of classes, a lot of students. I assign them a lot of writing work, and that's a lot of grading. And grading requires sitting still at a computer, and it's very hard for me to do that. Like, I'm still a competitive athlete. Like you mentioned before, I'm a skydiver, a professional and competitive skydiver. And I still perform my aerial acts sometimes. So I'm like such a physical person, and I'm always working out and moving and doing handstands and stuff. It's really hard for me to sit at a computer for hours and hours and hours, and I'm always behind on my grading, which my students just are extremely patient with, but I know they're frustrated. And then also when it comes to like publications, that's another thing that I struggle with, because like many people, you know, I struggle with anxiety and ADHD and all these things that many of my students also struggle with. And I'm really good at doing research, but when it comes to writing it up into an academic article, that's a process that I find really difficult and frustrating. And also, like, academic writing to me, like, who really reads that? It's often very pretentious, it's very jargon filled. I don't find it to be a very meaningful, like, mode of communication. I'd much rather talk in a clear, straightforward way. I love giving conference presentations, but when it comes to publishing in academic journals, I'm not the best at that. I did manage to write my dissertation in grad school, but it was a huge struggle. I almost had to like hire a therapist to see me through it, and I only got it done at the very last minute. And I did manage to turn that dissertation into a book that I'm really proud of. But it doesn't come easy to me, all that writing stuff, the sitting at the computer. I'm a very physical, artistic, performance person, and as an academic, you don't really get credit or merit for that.
Yeah.
So I would say I love my job. I love the teaching. The research part, I like that too, but the writing part is really tough for me.
Awesome. And you kind of touched on kind of the mental health aspect of students, and I had a question here for that actually. This is just something I was curious about. So you've been a professor for some time, I would say, right?
17 years.
I would say, like, have you noticed like a trend in students' mental health at all? Like,
that is such a good question.
because I was wondering if there's like a noticeable trend, just like qualitatively, not like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So of course I have, read the news reports and the research that say that there are much, much higher rates of anxiety and depression now among young people than there were before. I always wonder how much of that is because people recognize it now, that they feel more comfortable coming forward with it now. It's possible that there was just as much anxiety and depression before, but people didn't, see it as something that they could talk about publicly or that they could seek help with. So it could be that people are just more willing to seek help and come forward with this stuff. But I also think that various things that have happened, like COVID, really, really affected people's mental health, for sure. And I think that there is kind of an epidemic of anxiety and depression among the college students that I see. I think I've always noticed a lot of students, admitting that they're having these struggles at a point where they start failing the class and they want to explain why that's happening. It's a tricky thing because I know a lot of professors who seem to have what we call compassion fatigue about students' mental health issues. And after they get a few emails from different students saying that they're suffering from depression, anxiety, these professors lose patience and almost feel like, okay, at this point I don't want to hear it anymore, and almost like they don't believe students. And that bothers me because I think we as professors are very lucky to have the jobs that we have. We also struggle with mental health issues. We have no reason to not believe students when they're telling us they're struggling. Just because we might have grown up in an era where if you were having those problems, you were supposed to just suck it up and deal with it, and you weren't supposed to, ask for help or ask for more time or ask for leniency, like if you're failing the class. Just because we grew up in that era doesn't mean that we can just transfer that judgmental attitude onto the students of today. And also, I think a lot of things are really, really harder for students today than they were for, say, my generation. For example, the cost of college, the difficulty of getting a job, paying off your student loans. There's a lot of things that, I think have caused students today to have more anxiety and maybe less hope about the future, for themselves, of their careers, of the country. So for me as a professor, when I'm responding or hearing these students talk about the mental health struggles, I really try to adopt an approach of what I call radical empathy, which is I don't stop being empathetic once I've gotten 10 student emails about depression and anxiety. I want to have unlimited empathy for all my students, and I also want to take them at their word, not question whether they're just trying to come up with some excuse. For me, that's really important for my integrity, is to be consistent with my empathy towards students. And I think if you're going to be empathic about students that are struggling, you've got to be empathic for everyone. You can't be like, well, I feel bad for you and I understand your situation because you're a varsity athlete and I went through that myself, and so I know all the pressures and how tired you are, and I do really understand what athletes are going through. But I can't extend that empathy to student athletes and then not extend it to someone who's in a very different but equally tiring and stressful situation. Like they're working the night shift at Taco Bell and they've got a kid and like maybe they've got a parent who's sick and like everyone's dealing with different shit and it's all valid. And for me, like I just really believe in extending radical empathy to everyone, especially because this is not pre-med. This is popular culture.
Yeah.
If they need more time to turn in an assignment in popular culture, who is it hurting? and also, like, I've already admitted that I'm really bad at grading their assignments on time. What am I going to do? Be like, oh no, you were late on that assignment, points off, whereas I haven't even graded it yet. Like, no, that would be extremely hypocritical, very unfair. So in a way, like I'm asking my students to have understanding, patience, and empathy with me, and I think it's only fair to extend that to them as well. All of us are struggling with stuff, some of which we're willing to admit, some we're not because it's more private, but everyone, to me, is, at least in a popular culture class, everyone deserves that flexibility and that compassion and the benefit of the doubt. I think too many professors don't give students the benefit of the doubt. They're ready to assume that students are lying, that they're cheating, that they're lazy. I mean, what is laziness? Sometimes laziness is depression. Sometimes laziness is exhaustion. Sometimes you need it. I admit it bothers me when students email me that they're taking a mental health day so they can't attend my Zoom class, because to attend a Zoom class, you just need to turn on your computer, and I don't force people to have their cameras on if they're having a hard time. So can't they just like tune in and at least listen, even if they're having a mental health day? But again, I try to tell myself radical empathy. I guess there's times that I too can't stay awake through a Zoom meeting. It's happened to me in faculty meetings. Sometimes I'm like, oh, wait a minute, the meeting's over? Damn, I passed out, you know? So again, radical empathy. I would like every professor to try to test out that concept. But I feel like professors just sometimes don't have the perspective of how privileged and easy, you know, we have it compared to circus performers and students.
I bet. All right, well, I'm going to touch a little bit on the research, not too much. I did see you did some stuff on like dramatic drunk driving prevention programs.
Yes.
And I was curious about that because in my driver's ed, our drunk driving stuff wasn't crazy, but I saw you talking about like reenactments of car crashes and like fake funerals. Like, could you just kind of detail a bit of that experience maybe or?
Yeah. So I've always been someone who's really interested in how we cope with like the proximity of death or the chances of dying, especially because I do a lot of really high risk stuff. When I entered grad school, I think everyone assumed that I would write a dissertation about some of these subcultures that I was part of, like the circus or the cliff diving. That's kind of how I got into grad school, is by saying I was going to do that. But when it came down to it, those are very like pure experiences for me. Circus, performing, cliff diving, these are like means of expressing yourself in a very simple and pure way physically, and I didn't want to like ruin it by putting academic language onto it. So I started looking around for like what could I write about that would still really interest me and relate to my curiosity about how people cope with risk, mortality, and death. And I remember just finding out in a news report about this weird program where like when I was in high school, they did the mock car crash. It was called like Prom Promise or something. So, you know, the scene of the car crash in front of the school, and a few people get picked out to be like made up in gory makeup, and they're on the hood of the car, and then the ambulance shows up, and it's supposed to, you know, shock you into realizing that drinking and driving has deadly consequences. But in the 90s, when I was in graduate school, this program started taking off where they had And it was created by some people up in the Pacific Northwest, and then it really just spread like wildfire. So it was this very elaborate 2-day ritual where you would have the Grim Reaper going around in classrooms, picking out about 20 students to be part of the, quote, living dead, who would be made up in gray makeup and black clothes. And then the living dead would be separated from the rest of the school for a couple days, and they would go through this ritual where they would write letters to their parents from beyond the grave. Sometimes they would go to the courthouse, go to jail, go to the ER, and basically be sort of removed and told that they couldn't speak or like contact their parents. It was supposed to be this experiential ritual that would convince the living dead to sort of then bring that message back to the rest of the students. You know, being dead was awful, you guys. You know, like it was so sad, and I'm like, let's not let that happen. But there were all these like very emotionally manipulative aspects of the program. Plus, there was all kinds of hypocrisy.
It was very unethical.
And also the kids that were chosen for the living dead were usually the most popular kids. Now, there were reasons for that the organizers explained to me, like, oh, these are the influencers, right? So it's, you know, it'll have more impact if it's the popular kids that are getting killed because everybody wants to be like them, right? Well, to me, it seemed like there were a lot of students who were really resentful, who felt excluded, who felt like these kids are getting even more attention, you know, they're already popular and now everyone's crying over them, and there's a graveyard set up in the quad, and there's eulogies being posted in the hallways, and, you know, flowers and mock funeral with coffins and candles, and like these kids are getting to be the stars. And the kids who are actually struggling the most, who are maybe needing attention, needing somebody to step in and help them with addictions or, you know, neglect, these kids often had already gotten in trouble and were not allowed to participate in extracurricular activities. And even if it wasn't that extreme, they weren't usually chosen to be part of this like special group that got all this attention. And come on, 2 days at a hotel, you know, with your friends, that's not necessarily just a traumatic experience. That's also a fun break from school. So I was really interested in sort of the difference between what the purposes of the program were and how it actually unfolded. And one of the things I was studying was, what are the things that make people decide that this program was successful or not? And what are people really getting out of it? And so while the whole premise was about changing their attitudes and beliefs about death, that didn't turn out to be the conclusion that I came to. The conclusion was, this was a lot of fun, and people need attention. They like being in the spotlight. There's a lot of power dynamics going on, and it was really fascinating to watch this program play out in hundreds of different schools all around the country. So it was really fun research, although also a little bit grueling because the topic is tough. And now and then I would find myself getting really emotional. But mostly I was just kind of irritated at how manipulative the adults were being, and just sort of baffled by all the hypocrisy everywhere, including the title of the program, Every 15 Minutes, was based on a statistic that was long outdated. Not true anymore, but they wouldn't change the title because they said only that title would really
shock people.
Or seem meaningful. And then it was always interesting to ask the paramedics and the firefighters and the policemen, hey, do you think this program is really having an effect?
I bet they didn't like it.
Well, they loved it because it gave them a chance to practice their procedures. And also because, you know, they would say to me, well, look, what a great time everyone's having. Like, this is really fun. Like, this is exciting for everyone. But if I asked them, do you think this is really working? They would say, oh, no, this has no impact on the actual statistics. And what is causing the statistics to get better is better emergency medicine. We have better ambulances, you know, better response time, stricter drunk driving laws. And then over the years, it turned out that, you know, as kids started driving a little bit less with insurance rates going up, and then everyone got cell phones, and teenagers had more ways to connect socially, more mobility through the internet, and didn't have to rely as much on their cars, that also affected the statistics of drinking and driving. And then, of course, texting and driving became almost a bigger problem. And now we've moved on to mass shooting drills. So, like, that era is kind of over now.
Oh, man.
But for me, the whole, like, reason to really dive into it academically had to do originally with this curiosity that I have about life and death and how people perceive, like, taking life for granted or worrying about death or, you know, evaluating what risks are worth taking. And this is something, you know, that I think about a lot myself as I do, you know, as a skydiver. I have a lot of friends who get killed in these skydiving events. Death is always, like, right there around the corner, and you have to be, in a way, accepting of it, but also extremely vigilant to try to stay safe. And I think one thing people often don't quite understand, you know, I'm somebody that really struggles with anxiety and depression, but, you know, to an extreme extent. Like, I have real, like, physical manifestations of these problems. So another reason that I can really empathize with my students. But I think for some people, it's like, well, how can she go and jump out of a plane if she has anxiety? And I think it's very important to understand that there's so many different ways in which people experience anxiety and cope with it. And what makes one person anxious is not at all the same thing that makes another person anxious. So, for example, I can't just assume that because I'm teaching on Zoom, my student isn't going to feel social anxiety about participating in class. Maybe they have that anxiety even participating on Zoom, even though we're not in the classroom together. For me, to be in a classroom, like an enclosed space where, you know, a lot of our classrooms don't even have windows, you're really kind of trapped. For me, that's extremely difficult to deal with. Causes me, like, stomach aches and sleeplessness and all kinds of symptoms. For me, we don't actually jump out out of the plane, we just step out. Stepping out the door of a plane at 20,000 feet to do a formation with 200 other people feels quite normal.
That sounds so scary.
Like, I'm sure, and when you're learning to skydive, there's absolutely that adrenaline, there's that fear, for sure. But
I don't know if I could do it.
Well, when you do your first skydive, you usually do a tandem. So you're not responsible for keeping yourself alive, and even so, many people are afraid to do a tandem.
I've thought about it.
Well, if you ever want to do it, I can certainly direct you to a good, safe drop zone where the instructors are very well trained and where the risk will be very minimal. But skydiving is inherently dangerous, but the more competence and experience you have, the more you know what all the dangers are and how to either prevent them or to deal with them if they happen. So, for example, if my parachute malfunctions, I know right away what is going on and I know what to do. And, you know, we call it cutting away. So you release your main parachute and you deploy your reserve parachute. The chances of both parachutes failing is so tiny. It really is. But you have to make sure you take care of your equipment. Like, you can't just treat it like crap. You have to make sure it's updated, that you have riggers checking it, that everything is in good working order. So I, for example, I'm very compulsive about making sure that all my equipment is in top shape. So, you know, I actually have had very few malfunctions, only 2 I've done about 4,000 skydives in my career. And, well, my partner, Mario, has done about 20,000.
That's awesome.
So he's been at it a lot longer than me. But I've had very few malfunctions, and part of that is that I'm very careful. So I was just going to say that for me to step out of that plane and do an extremely difficult, extremely dangerous, as in, like, there's a lot of things that could go wrong, skydive doesn't cause my heart to pound. If my heart is pounding, it's probably only because I'm like, I want to do a perfect job and, like, this is our last chance to, like, make it perfectly. But it's not about fear that I'm going to die, because I'm always vigilant about how I could die and what I need to do to make sure that doesn't happen. So that's hard for a lot of people to understand, because skydiving seems like something that would be terrifying, and yet there are things about regular everyday life that most people find very easy that I find really terrifying. And so I'm just going to assume that that's how anxiety is for everyone, that you can't always rationally explain what it is that's going to cause you to be in great distress.
I think you're right.
Thank you.
I know you're right.
It could be something like having a meal with somebody. It could be seeing a dog. Like, we all have these things, and it's like folklore is all about the intersection of our personal experiences and our cultural traditions. And each person has, you know, this body of experiences, memories, traumas, and also these cultural factors. And so I'm endlessly interested in each individual's struggles and also the skills that they have acquired that help them, you know, make their way in life. And for me, I've always felt very, very comfortable high up in the air. There's no reason for that. I was born that way. Like, the higher up in the air I am, the more I feel like I'm at home, this is where I belong. But if I'm out on a boat and the water is dark and I can't see what's below me, oh my God, I'm going to freak out. Like, I can't swim in a pond without, like, absolutely like major anxiety. I like to see what's below me. I'm very uncomfortable with water. So I really hate it when people, and you have not done this, so thank you, but lots of people that interview me about my experiences throw around terms like adrenaline junkie and daredevil and thrill seeker. It's not true at all. I am not a thrill seeker. I don't speed in my car. I'm super careful about many things in my life, and lots of things terrify me. Like, you will never get me scuba diving. You know, now if I were really a thrill seeker, I'd be like, oh yeah, I want to go into space, you know, I want to scuba dive. No fucking way. Like, skydiving, I'm competent. I've learned, I'm trained. I'm in control to a certain extent. The things I'm not in control of, I know how to try to avoid them. Like, if there's someone else on the skydive that's really dangerous, I am competent enough that I can watch out for them, I can stay away from them, and if they're about to slam into me, I can get out of their way. And it took years of training to have that ability to keep myself safe that way.
Man, all right. Well, we're kind of already getting there, but in the last little section of the interview, I kind of want to touch on some like deeper questions. I think we've kind of progressed there already.
Yeah.
But this is more of a broader one, so you can answer it however you wish, I guess. But like, do you have like a life philosophy? Or like if so, like what is that kind of philosophy?
You know, what really comes to mind for me immediately when you ask me that question, it again has to do with death. I feel like people take life much too much for granted. I do not assume that I'm going to live past tomorrow, let alone next year, 10 years from now. So I feel it's really important not to put things off. I try to tell people how I feel about them without putting it off. I am not really a long-term planner. When I see exciting, interesting, meaningful opportunities, I go after them. And I think a lot of people are afraid to do that. So I would say my kind of life philosophy is to, dive into the things that are meaningful to me without the assumption that I can do them later. Sometimes that causes me to not sort of set up long-term planning for myself in the best way. And also it can create problems when I decide to do something that I find very immediate and personally meaningful and don't get my work done because I'm doing that. But yeah, that sort of do it while you can and don't just assume that you can put it off and do it, you know. It's really important to spend time with loved ones. It's really important to pursue your artistic dreams. It's really important to go visit people that might not be around for much longer. Like, these are things that I really try to do every single day, and it's kind of like knowing what my values are and what I prioritize, and then making sure that I won't look back and go, why did I never go visit my sister, and why did I never spend that time, or why did I not spend the money to take my partner to this show that I know he really wants to see? So like how I might act about money would fall into that philosophy. Like if this is a meaningful thing that I'm always going to remember, then it's worth doing. Meanwhile, I'm not somebody that saves up any money really. I tend to spend my money as I earn it, because I'm always like, but I might not be alive next month, so like let's go do this thing, even if it costs. Like I don't go into debt, but I don't save money either. Now I have that luxury because I have a good job. If I didn't have a steady job, I'm sure I would save a little more. Other than that, so that's my personal philosophy of like how I lead my own life. But I have a couple of mantras that I always try to repeat to my students as far as like just looking at the world and teaching. In teaching, one of them is all generalizations are false, which I love that quote because it's kind of meta. Like all generalizations are false. That is a generalization. So I really don't like when people make these blanket statements or say, well, this is the way things are, or this is the way people are, or even this is the way you are. Life is unpredictable. People are endlessly changeable and varied, and you can't just assume something about someone because of anything. Like somebody who's Catholic you don't know what that means to them. Somebody who's Muslim, you don't know what that means to them, or Mormon, or because they grew up in Bowling Green, or because they live in New York City, or because they're LGBTQ. Everyone is an individual who's unique and idiosyncratic, and so I always resist generalizations. Unfortunately, academia is full of them. So one of the things I'm constantly doing in my classes is like when I show my students documentaries or have them do readings, I'm always pointing out, look at all these generalizations. These aren't necessarily true. There's tons of exceptions. No matter what, there's always exceptions. And then also another favorite quote of mine is from Pete Seeger, the folk musician, who says, there's a genius to simplicity. Any damn fool can get complicated. And I think also, especially in academia, there's a tendency for people to want to validate themselves or prove themselves by using as many complicated sentences and long words as possible. And that's actually not as effective and not as difficult as clearly communicating something through more simple language. And so when I assign writing to my students, what I really want them to do is give me a lot of detail that makes like vivid descriptions of stuff. That's what folklore research is. It's really good, detailed documentation of what people do, what they say they believe. Otherwise, we can't really understand people unless we get into that detail. So generalizations and theoretical assumptions about stuff, that's all just like meaningless words. I need really good detailed examples, and that's a form of like simplicity. So I'm trying to train my students to write real stuff, concrete stuff, vivid stuff, and not get lost in the academic speak that I think other classes pressure them to engage in.
Right. I got another one here.
Okay.
Got a biggest or proudest accomplishment? Like, what are you most proud of doing? Do you have one? Or is there so many that it's hard to pick one? Or
I have a few, and they're really different.
Really?
Okay, so one was writing my book because it was so hard for me. Like doing aerial acrobatics, that comes naturally to me. Not that it's not hard, but that's my element. Writing my book was truly a struggle, and I can't believe I actually got it done and that it got published. So I'm really proud of that, and it's when I try to think about writing my next one, it's very daunting. Like just because I wrote one, I know how hard that was. It's I have a lot of fear and anxiety about like how am I ever going to get the next one written. So that's one thing I'm super proud of. But then it's weird, this also came to mind just now, but in the first 5 years that I was teaching here, I was in a relationship that was really abusive. And I'm a very loyal, devoted person who, like, again, is very empathetic and tries to accept people as they are. And that kind of made it hard for me to leave that relationship. And I tried several times, and it was a really miserable time. It kind of drained my spirit. Like, I was not my normal self while I was in that relationship. When I finally managed to leave it, it was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Now, I feel like most people would not think that that would be something I would bring up as my hardest, like most difficult, proudest thing, like Acapulco cliff diving, flying trapeze. No, the hardest thing I've ever done was actually leaving that abusive relationship. And it was mainly not physically abusive, but it was verbally, emotionally. There were times that like I would try to leave and he would restrain me, but it wasn't like he was beating me up. But now I really understand how even a very strong person can get stuck in a relationship like that. People can be really manipulative and controlling, and they can really have power over you, even if you think you would never get caught up in that. But I'm so, so proud of myself for eventually leaving it. I mean, it took me quite a few tries, and I had a lot of support from friends to help me. But that really just, for some reason, came to mind when you asked me that question.
Man, that's a good one. That's something I didn't expect. Really.
I did not even think I was gonna talk about that either. But I really think it's true.
Man, do you have like a biggest influence in life, or someone that's really motivated you to get to where you are now, or anything like that?
It is so hard for me to find anybody in the world who has had the kind of life I've had. Like, I have done so much zigzagging between like academia and like diving and skydiving and aerial arts and circus and like all these. I have various role models in these different worlds,
but not one.
But there's
cohesive.
Nobody that actually covers all of the
bases.
Yeah, so I can't say that there is one person that I can really say no.
Wow.
That's incredible.
Let's see. I have this one might be interesting. What is your biggest failure?
Oh, there's so many. That reminds me of another of my favorite quotes, and this is from Winston Churchill. Success consists of going from failure to failure without losing enthusiasm. So when I mention my series of aerial careers, to me, in my mind, each one of them has ended in failure.
Okay, not currently.
My flying trapeze career, the way that ended, I am I feel it was a disgrace. I'm embarrassed. I feel guilty about it. Like, I feel like a failure in that world. It seems like again and again I've reached sort of near the top of these different aerial careers and then not like actually succeeded, to my wildest dreams. But the way that I've had to leave them often involves standing up for myself against abuse or getting out of a situation that was like physically dangerous. My exit from the world of professional high diving was like that. I kind of had to like leave abruptly and tell them I had mono when really I was actually the situation was I had to live in a theme park with 5 guys that were not treating me very well, and I was getting very sick, like from an eating disorder. So to save my own health, I had to get out of there, but that wasn't an easy thing to do because when you're working in a theme park high diving show, if you don't do the show, somebody else doesn't get a day off.
Oh, yeah.
So actually we never got days off because there was always somebody that was like injured or sick or something. So you were letting your team down. And I had to leave them in order to preserve my health. But, everybody was mad and the boss was furious. And so that's happened to me in various ways in all these different arenas. It's been a problem in skydiving too. Like I was very near the top of, the ranks of 8-way formation skydiving. And then I got in trouble for something that I did politically that pissed people off. And so I sort of see my life as a series of failures to achieve like the top level
Mhm.
of these things that I pursued.
It's like a
And-
series of failures with like an upward trend.
Yeah, but I don't actually have regrets. Like,
Mhm.
it's not that I feel like I could have done things very differently.
Mhm.
And there's really only one thing in my life that I can think about that I have like true regret over. Like, I really wish I had done that differently. And honestly, I feel so bad about it that I don't really want to say it. But
Okay.
it has to do with, that abusive relationship I mentioned. So in general, I found that the things that felt like failures, like
Mhm.
what happened at the end of my circus career, what happened at the end of my high diving career, I feel like all those things, even though they felt like abject failures at the time,
Mhm.
they led to the next chapter in my life. That now, like, I would not have the partner that I have now
Mhm.
if I had met him 20 years earlier. It wouldn't have been the right timing.
Mhm.
So I don't really believe in regrets, because even things that are failures lead you to the next thing. And I'm not saying, I hate that saying, like, everything happens for a reason,
Mhm.
because I almost think it's offensive to say that to someone who's experienced tragedy.
Mhm.
And I don't count myself as someone who's had a lot of tragedy in my life,
Mhm.
but many people have. And to be like, oh, everything happens for a reason, it's all for the best.
Mhm.
You can't say that to someone who, like, lost their family members.
It's
And
very like
yeah.
dismissive.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like, oh, they're in a better place, or
Mhm.
like God has a plan. Like,
You
no,
can't
it's,
say that.
some things are just unfair, and you can't really ever accept them or feel like there's a reason that should have happened. But at least for me personally, there's nothing I would really go back and change it, because then I wouldn't be where I am right now, which I'm not exactly fine and happy and wonderful, but I'm absolutely grateful. I'm so grateful to have this job. I'm so grateful to have my partner, Mario. I'm so grateful to be able to skydive the way that,
Mhm.
we're able to. I'm just, to have a body that still functions.
Mhm.
I'm 53 years old, but I'm still in like really good athletic shape, and I'm grateful for that. And even the very difficult struggles I have with mental health issues,
Mhm.
I'm even grateful for those, because I think they make it easier for me to be compassionate and empathetic with my students.
Mhm. Man, well, as we wrap things up here, I got one last question.
Mm-hmm.
This will be the final one. So, college, for a lot of people, I would say it's kind of like a difficult time. People are figuring things out, have a lot of confusion. So, like, if you had one piece of advice to give, I guess, to all college students
Mhm.
or anyone listening, what
Mhm.
would it be?
Okay. Do whatever you can to stay out of debt.
Mm-hmm. That's
Okay.
a good one.
Because the reason is because it's the more free you can feel
Mm-hmm.
to make the choices that you want to take the opportunities that arise, to give yourself time to do whatever. Just the more free you can feel in your life
Mm-hmm.
to change your situation or to pursue things, the better. And the more debt you have, the less free you will feel.